Loneliness and being alone. Two different concepts that use very similar wording yet mean drastically different things. And the reason I wanted to delve into the difference between loneliness and being alone is because while they stem from the same concept, there is one key difference, and that difference is people. Now, a lot of this relates back to a lot of our early developments, just as a species as a whole, at least in my opinion. And the reason behind that, I think, is because, as many scientists have already laid out very clearly, humans are social creatures. And being social creatures means that we are naturally drawn to being around others, like ourselves, or just others in general. And I think that's where the distinction between loneliness and being alone comes in, because when you see someone who is alone, like being in their room or being in a house where there's no one else, or just being in the car, they don't feel alone. And I think that's important, because the main thing that I could distinguish between being alone and feeling alone is that for you to feel alone, you need to be constantly reminded that there are other people out there who are gathered while you're separated, versus when you are alone, it's not something that's in front of you, so you don't really pay attention to it. And the main reason that I guess I came up with this explanation was with the current climate of social media. And the main reason I say that is because the main focus of social media is for you to show, well, this most social side of your personality. And I think in large part what that contributes to is, well, a lot of people's loneliness, in a sense, where people who don't or aren't much active on most social media platforms, they go and see others who are constantly gathered, who only show their best lives, in a sense. They feel isolated, they feel alone, versus if you had that same person just in a room and left them to their own thoughts, I doubt that loneliness would be the first thing that comes to their mind in comparison to maybe the problems they're facing in their lives or something else. And I think that's an interesting distinction to make, because why is it that if we're not reminded of the existence of other people, we don't tend to care about it, but the second that we are, it's the only thing that we think about constantly? Well, I say a lot of that based off of personal experience. Well, not really personal experience, but just as a human. And I think you can agree with that too. It's a very weird situation where you don't care until you're made to care. And usually you're made to care of your own volition, in a sense. You willingly choose to go on social media, you willingly choose to interact with people online, you willingly choose to go on the internet and constantly be connected to a flux of information regarding people's lives, information that you'd usually have a conversation with them about. And I think that's, in a sense, weird. It's a one-way conversation where you're constantly being fed all the good events of someone else's life, and I think that in large part contributes to why a lot of people feel alone. I think it could possibly relate to why suicide rates are higher than they've ever been amongst teenagers, because, let's face it, when you're at a very young age, one of the main things that you look for, one of the most important things that you seek is an identity. And along with that, you seek a group of people who you could identify with. So to be on social media, to see different groups of people interacting with each other and spending time together and developing their identity naturally makes you feel self-conscious, makes you feel alone. If you had the same teenager in a room with their homework, they wouldn't really be concerned about being alone. They'd be concerned with whether their parents would be mad if they didn't finish their homework. And when you really think about it, why is that? Why is that when you're only reminded of people is when you start caring about them? You could chalk that up in a lot of ways to how maybe you care about a distant relative the second you're reminded of them, or maybe a friend you haven't talked to in a while. When you remember them, it's all you think about. You think to yourself, why haven't I messaged them? You feel guilty about not interacting with them in the long span of time that you haven't, and so you choose to interact with them. Why is it that that sticks to your mind? Now, while that is the main distinction that I could make between loneliness and feeling alone, I couldn't really come up with a reason as to why it occurs. I personally don't understand why when you're reminded of something is when you start caring about it the most. Why don't you go back to the same way you were doing things? I mean, just to give an example, I could remind you constantly that someday you're gonna die, but I don't think it's something that you'll ponder about all that much because, well, you know that. You've already known that for quite some time, even if you don't acknowledge it on a daily basis. And you don't ponder on it much because you just know it to be a fact. And I think the same could be said when you're apart from someone for an extended duration of time. You know deep down that you haven't talked to them, but you don't acknowledge it until you're forced to acknowledge it. And one of the means through which you are is through social media, because what social media does is it constantly reminds you of other people's lives. And to be fair, I don't understand why that distinction exists. Why does the human brain do that? I don't know, maybe this is something that's already answered in psychology in greater depth than someone like myself could ever understand or comprehend, but I thought I might as well talk about it because it's an interesting thing to think about. Why do we behave in the way we do when it comes to other people? I think it's a very important thing since for the majority of our lives, at least for the most of us, people are the biggest factor in how we behave and how we, I'd say, develop as people, just generally speaking. And so maybe it's that. Maybe I just answered my own question. Maybe the reason why it's so different when it comes to social situations is because, well, to an extent, we're dependent on everyone else. And so the second we're reminded of it, we can't stop thinking about it. Maybe the reason why, if we're reminded that, well, we're alone and we're not spending time with others while they are with each other, we fear that we're going to lose that connection, losing that lifeline in a sense that might come in handy someday, but we don't know yet. And, well, that could be why, and it could be something else. I don't know. Maybe it's already been answered, maybe it hasn't, but I hope you enjoyed thinking about it for what it's worth. And yeah, that's all I wanted to address. The difference between being alone and loneliness. A lot of it boils down to people, and you could ask yourself to an extent whether those people even care. Like, what if the person that say you wanted to be around with, or the person you hadn't interacted with a while, just doesn't care about you? That's unlikely to say the least. Maybe if they were reminded of the fact that they hadn't interacted with you in the same way that you were reminded that you didn't interact with them, maybe they would also be concerned about it or want to do something about it, but who knows? You can't delve into other people's minds, so you wouldn't really have an answer to that. And yeah, that's the note I wanted to leave this video off on. Thank you for listening.